Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, as always, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kim Hill. He is a professor in the Anthropology department at Arizona State University. Dr. Hill's theoretical interests are human evolutionary ecology, including focal areas such as foraging theory, time allocation, food sharing, life history evolution, parental investment, cooperation, culture and cognition, the emergence and spread of Homo sapiens, and the unique characteristics of our species. And today we're going to talk about most of these topics. So, Dr. Hill, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I would like to start the interview because I would like to go through most of your work, or at least the main points of it. I would like to start by asking you about some of the main societies you've studied and then get into the more general questions about them. Let's start perhaps with the Aché. So, what type of society is this, and what aspects of their sociality have you studied?
Yeah, so most of my career I specialized in studying hunter-gatherer societies, and these are groups that live entirely off wild resources with no domestic plants or animals. So the Aché, up through the mid 20th century, were isolated hunter-gatherers living in Paraguay, living entirely off wild resources, highly mobile social groups and very small residential groups. We know from historical records they were isolated at least since the first Europeans arrived in South America, right up through the 20th century. Linguistic and genetic studies show that they're somewhat affiliated and probably derived from a mixture of Tupi-Guarani groups and Jay-speaking groups from southern Brazil. In the 20th century, and when I first met them in the 1970s, the Aché were still hunting with bows and arrows and, interestingly, still using stone tools. So there aren't many groups left in the world that were using stone tools in the 20th century. Um, they were in constant conflict with Paraguayan peasants and also Guarani-speaking tribal groups that surrounded them. And they suffered pretty horrendously at contact from disease epidemics, which is something that I also learned a lot about. And then finally, when I started collecting scientific data on them around 1979, I started out first looking at what's called foraging theory. Then I moved into time allocation patterns, interested in food sharing, cooperation. Then by the late 1980s, I had moved into what biologists call life history theory and demography. And then in maybe the last 15 years, I've focused mainly on cooperation and interaction patterns between social groups and things having to do with who lives with who and who helps who over the lifespan.
Right. So another group that you've studied is, and I hope I'm not butchering their name, is the Hiwi from Venezuela. Could you tell us about them?
Yeah, they call themselves Hiwi in their own language. The local people refer to them as Cuiva. Again, like the Aché, they were also hunter-gatherers. They weren't quite as mobile as the Aché. They tended to live in more permanent settlements during the wet season. They also lived in a slightly different ecology, which was an open woodland savanna rather than high primary tropical forest. And they had a few interesting differences. They used canoes quite a bit and were much more oriented to riverine resources. Um, they also had extremely hostile relations with local invading colonists coming into rural. This is down near the border of Venezuela and Colombia. And one of the, I did that expansion to another group mainly because I didn't want to get obsessed with believing that the Aché represented all human ancestral past as hunter-gatherers, and so I thought I need to at least see another couple groups of hunter-gatherers. And one of the things that really struck me immediately was how different the Hiwi were. I wasn't so surprised to find similarities, but there were some big differences, and we're going to talk about them later in this interview, I think. But things like the Hiwi used a lot of drugs. The Aché don't use any drugs at all. The Hiwi did a lot of dancing and singing. The Aché don't even have any dancing. Hiwi had very high, what we would call marital stability, low divorce rates, and the Aché were on the opposite end. The Hiwi had much more restricted sharing patterns, and the Aché were much more communal. So immediately I discovered that even two South American hunter-gatherer groups can still be very different.
Mhm. And then also in South America, in Peru, you studied groups like the Mashco-Piro, the Matsiguenga and the Yora. Could you tell us about them?
Yeah, all three of those groups are in the region around Manu National Park in Peru, which is the largest national park in South America. It's also one of the most remote areas of the Amazon still today. And I was interested again in expanding my comparative knowledge base to other tribes. The Mashco-Piro were the group that most attracted me because they were known to be hunter-gatherers, and they were also the most remote, isolated, and uncontacted group that we knew about at that time. This would have been back in the early 1980s. I spent a lot of time in Manu National Park just trying to do surveys of the three populations and learn a little bit about how they make a living, collecting basic economic data, and also trying to make decisions with the help of a lot of native guides and informants in the area about whether or not peaceful contacts with isolated groups would be possible and whether or not it would be advisable.
Mhm. And then, I mean, we've been focusing on South America mostly. You've also studied foraging problems in coastal South Africa. So, what did you study there specifically?
Yeah, I think maybe about 15 years ago, I decided that I had already done uh, 30 years of research in lowland South America in remote inland terrestrial habitats, and I got interested in looking at coastal foragers a little bit. There was a lot of stuff coming out in the literature about early Homo sapiens on the coasts of South Africa, cave sites like Pinnacle Point, where they were finding a lot of shellfish by 200,000 years ago, and a lot of speculation that maybe moving into a marine foraging niche might have changed the social organization of early humans, particularly in some predictable ways from kind of behavioral ecology theory, that it was believed that marine resources were dense and predictable, whereas terrestrial resources tend to be much more dispersed and highly unpredictable in time and space. And so I thought I'd like to look at some people who are doing a lot of marine foraging and see if it really is true that you can get high return rates from food acquisition, and that it's the resources are dense and predictable, which might allow large residential groups and territoriality and maybe a lot more intergroup competition as they're fighting over real estate that's worth controlling, whereas in dispersed terrestrial hunter-gatherers, it's really not worth invading a neighboring area because you can't be guaranteed that there's anything there that's going to be there tomorrow, for example. So I was interested in the emergence of intergroup competition and cooperation in large group sizes in human evolution, and decided that maybe I should go look at marine coastal foragers, because we know that when hominins come out of Africa, they follow the seacoasts originally for thousands of years, and a lot of early human history out of Africa was probably coastal marine foraging.
Mhm. And then you also studied sea nomads in the Philippines, and I think you focused on human cooperation there, right?
Yeah, so what I discovered in Africa is that I could get local Khoisan people who had a history in the area to do experiments with me on marine foraging and collect information. But those groups were already acculturated to the point where they weren't really marine dependent hunter gatherers. And I wanted to go to an area of the world where we really had essentially foraging groups dependent on marine resources. I started looking around in island Southeast Asia and decided the Philippines would be a particularly good place to work. And I went to the island of Mindanao in southern Philippines to work with people that call themselves Sama tribal people. The local people call them Bajau, and in English they're generally known as sea gypsies or sea nomads. And I got interested in studying cooperation once again. So we started recording all the resource transfers between households. This would be all material goods, so not just food resources, but also people exchanging things like medicines or adornments or clothing or tools or everything. And we did a 4-year sample on the complete exchange of all resource transfers in a Sea Gypsy village. And it was pretty fascinating to me. Some of what we found was what we could have guessed from earlier food sharing studies in hunter-gatherers. It was pretty well established that kinship is very important in determining who you give food to and who you receive from. And also reciprocity is very easy to demonstrate correlations between households that give a lot and receive a lot from each other. But one of the things we found in the Sama that I hadn't really been so aware of in the earlier hunter-gatherer food sharing studies is that so kinship and reciprocity were both very important, but a lot of the kinship justification for giving was based on extremely distant connections. So people that might have 6 or 8 links required in order to connect them genealogically. And as a biologist, I immediately realized that the coefficient of genetic relatedness between such distant kin is virtually zero, close to zero. So you can't explain why you're sharing so much with those people by simply using inclusive fitness theory, because they don't really have much of a genetic connection. You know, we're talking about your grandmother's sister's daughter's son's spouse or something like that. And I got interested in why it is that really distant kin relationships, as long as they can be identified, still seem to be sufficient to justify transferring resources back and forth. And this has led us into something new that we're still working on right now, which is trying to understand the expansion of cooperative networks using, tricks, in this case, using tricks of genealogical information, so that you can justify that you should share with somebody because they're kin, even though from a biological point of view, they're really sharing almost none of your genes. And this also led us into thinking about affines and why it is that humans uniquely recognize and preferentially share with in-laws, whereas no other animal in the world does that pattern.
Mm-hmm. So, some general questions about the societies we've been talking about that you've studied. So, what would you say you have learned from studying these societies that perhaps you would have missed if you focused all your work, for example, on Western industrialized societies?
Yeah, well, actually, that started out being one of my initial questions. One of the reasons that originally I was trained in molecular genetics and I worked in a lab, and I got interested in going to remote villages and remote societies because I wanted to know how different they are. So that the first question is, are they really different? Or basically, are they pretty similar to Western people? And so, you got to actually collect some data in order to answer that question. And later on, many years later, I became kind of critical of fields of study like sociology and psychology, where they were heavily focused on Western study subjects. And, I said, based on my 40 years of research in the most remote tribes in the world, I would say that sometimes those people don't really tell us much about our human history. And luckily, people like Joe Henrich really picked up on that and expanded it into this whole concept that there are weird societies, Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic, and that those societies really do show up to be different in a lot of ways. So I kind of, started thinking that in my own mind, but the first couple years I was really blown away by both differences and similarities. I was interested in both things, and I think I found a lot of both. So what I would say is that the differences that shocked me in my first few years of field work, having grown up in what I would call a pampered middle class American background, is that I'd say the biggest thing I noticed right off the bat within a couple of weeks is death was all around me. I have close friends dying, and the threat, the possibility that people could die. In my own field work, I've seen up close more than 100 individuals die, within a few feet of me, and most Americans haven't had that experience. So it gives you a very different perspective on the reality that we live a very pampered lifestyle, and we're not really obsessed a lot with things like, is tomorrow going to come and so on. Um, I can remember not just the threat of death, but suffering in general. People romanticize, particularly usually probably people who haven't done a lot of field work, romanticize living, with remote tribes and so on. And it is fun, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but it's also rough. It's not like just going camping for the weekend. It's more like a never-ending camping trip where you run out of supplies and you're getting eaten alive by mosquitoes and getting. I remember in my diary the first month I was in the field, I wrote. I still have these old pages. I wrote one on one page. I have seen my own blood every single day for the past month. And that struck me because normally in America, I don't cut and injure myself on a daily basis. I might only see my own blood, once every couple months. And there it was a daily thing. So life is rough, and that leads people to have what I would call high rates of time discounting, kind of focus on immediate returns because you never know if tomorrow's going to come or next week or whatever. On the other hand, there were also, I would say, there were some positives that I also began to notice, like despite the fact that physically, life was really difficult. A lot of hunger, by the way. I had never experienced hunger in my life as an American, and I saw a lot of hunger. I heard kids crying at night to their parents that they wanted something to eat, and there was nothing in camp to eat, and so on. There's a reason why hunter-gatherers are small and short, and they weigh a lot less than Americans. We all know that nutritional stress through developmental childhood leads to that. And sure enough, that's what I saw people experience. But there was also a lot of happiness in a way that was kind of hard to pin down. Um, but I would say maybe despite, like I said, the difficulty of life, fewer worries and cares and less anxiety. So that's kind of ironic and seems strange, but I think it's because small scale societies have good social support networks. They're surrounded by family all the time. It kind of feels like going to a big family reunion and all of your aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents and everybody's there. And most of the time, everybody's laughing and happy, and there are people who've got your back who will take care of you if you get injured or sick or whatever. And the other thing besides family is friendships. You're around your tight buddies and close friends, people you've known your whole life, not just somebody you met in your undergraduate class last week, but people you've known since you were 3 years old. And again, you can count on them. So I think that that's a really different feeling than living in a Western society. I think academically, the thing that probably shocked and surprised me the most, I hadn't thought very much about what I thought I might find, but what I discovered is societies built on levels of cooperation that were beyond my imagination. And, I guess if I had lived in America back in the 1920s or something, when people went next door and asked their neighbor to borrow a cup of sugar, I might have had better insights. But, you know, I was amazed at how they have just incredible dependence on cooperation. In modern societies, we have built institutions that cover uncertainty. So we have banking, savings accounts, we have health insurance and life insurance, and all kinds of institutions that, automobile accident insurance, whatever. If something goes wrong, we cover it through institutions. And also we have law enforcement agencies that keep the peace and the safety, personal security, and so on. So we've built a very cushy, comfortable society. And in remote societies, all of that has to come from your kin and your neighbors. So whether or not you're safe depends on whether or not you've got allies watching your back for you. Whether or not you're going to have food tomorrow, if you fail to get any for yourself, depends on having sharing partners, and so on and so on. And that interdependence leads to levels of cooperation in small-scale societies that I hadn't really imagined growing up in America. And I think that's one of the things that surprised and shocked me the most.
Mm-hmm. So, with all of that in mind, and since you mentioned some of the advantages and disadvantages of living in a traditional society versus a modern industrialized one, I would like to ask you, so because among certain people there's this kind of view that, we can answer the question of if it's better to live in one kind of society versus the other, and there's this sort of progressive view, like for example, that agricultural societies are more, in terms of progress, they are more advanced than hunter-gatherer societies. Industrial societies are more advanced than agricultural societies, and so on. And some people have this sort of view that it would be better to live in an industrial society versus an agricultural one versus an hunter-gatherer society. But do you think that through the eyes of an anthropologist who has lived among these different kinds of traditional societies, that those sorts of questions, and particularly that debate between the Hobbesians and the Rousseauians, let's say, makes any sense?
Well, the difficulty is because, as I mentioned, there are pluses and minuses. And so it's kind of like sometimes my friends say to me, where would you rather live? I went to graduate school in San Diego, California. It's a really pretty nice place to live. Where would you rather live, in San Diego or in some place up in the mountains in Wyoming, which I also happen to like a lot because I like to. And my answer is usually, well, it's really hard to choose because there's pluses and minuses. And so what I learned from, I've probably done, I would guess, I've never tried to verify this, I may have done more fieldwork in remote societies than any currently living person on the planet, any anthropologist that I know of. So I have spent a lot of time in very remote tribal societies, and there are lots of things I really enjoy and appreciate about that. But then there's downsides too. Like I said, the difficulty of life, the hunger and the disease, not so much disease, but injuries and parasites and, daily suffering, and the uncertainty of danger, whether or not your village is going to be raided tomorrow and half the people are going to be slaughtered, so there's pluses and minuses. And I've had this debate, not really debate, a little bit of a discussion with Joe Henrich too about weird societies, and are weird societies where we should all want to live? Because there's some really good things. I think economically they do well, and they have what we might consider more fair systems that respect kind of universal justice and human rights and so on. On the other hand, living in kin-based societies, you've got, like I said before, people who are watching your back all the time, and that feels really good. In some ways, I think the human psyche is actually better adapted to living in kin-based societies than living in weird societies where the kinship structure has intentionally been broken down in order to create a larger political unit where everybody is basically equal, and we get rid of corruption and so on because you can't favor friends and allies in those systems. But on the other hand, living in systems where you have tight friends and allies and kin is very comforting to the human psyche. So I would, I enjoy being in tribal villages, but I don't think I would want to live there my whole life. And, to me, the ultimate test is some people romanticize, isolated tribal populations. Do those people really want to go back? Some of them have the opportunity. I wouldn't say they all do, but some of them, if they wanted to, could go back in the forest and hide themselves and live the way their ancestors did. And you never see that happening. My reading of the literature is that once you've come out to the bigger world and seen the benefits of things like modern medicine and a stable food supply and stuff like that, it's awfully hard to want to go back to a place where only 50% of all the children born survive to adulthood. So the truth is, in remote tribal populations, hunter-gatherer societies, we've got great demographic data showing that only about 50% of all the kids born survive to age 15. Do you really want to live like that? As a parent, would you be happy if half your kids are going to die? So the bottom line is that when people are given the choice, they rarely, almost never, choose to go back. And I guess I'm going to have to go with that. There are lots of wonderful things about remote, small-scale societies, but we need to somehow find a way to incorporate those things into our modern society, but not give up all the benefits that we've also got in modern society.
Yeah. So the societies you've studied, would you say that they are representative of the kinds of hunter-gatherer societies we evolved in?
Yeah, I don't like the word representative because it implies that you can take a modern hunter-gatherer group, for example, and use it as an analogy for the past.
Okay.
And very early on, because of my academic training, I never really believed that analogies were a useful way to think about things. I think that what we're doing with modern hunter-gatherer societies is using them to examine the variables, the causal variables that lead to outcomes. So, did our ancestors share a lot in the past? I don't think you can say, well, the Aché share a lot in the right now, and so the Aché represent our ancestors, therefore everybody must have shared. What you can do is you can use the Aché to study what conditions lead to food sharing, and then you can say, if those conditions were true in the past, then our ancestors must have shared a lot of food in the past. So yeah, I don't want to claim that any modern hunter-gatherer group is a good analogy, but they're a great study population for understanding what kinds of, what are the relevant causal variables that lead to outcomes. And then once we understand that, we can use uniformitarian assumptions. Like if you asked me, did apples fall from trees 3 million years ago? I would say yes, but my answer yes is not because apples fall today, and use that as an analogy, but because we can use apples falling from trees to establish the principle of gravity. And once we understand that gravity is a law based on attractions between bodies that have mass, as long as we believe that the Earth had mass 3 million years ago and apples had mass, we can be sure that apples fell to the ground because we know the causal connection, not because apples fall today to the ground. So that's the way I think we need to be using hunter-gatherer studies, is using them to understand what would have happened under certain conditions in the past, and then if we can establish those conditions, then we know what was going on in our ancestral past.
I understand. So, but when you want to study a particular aspect of human sociality, like, I don't know, for example, foraging or parental investment, is it the case that some societies are better models to study each specific aspect of human sociality than others, or is that not really the way it works?
Yeah, some societies have to be better because some societies have irrelevant variables going on that wouldn't have applied in the past, and therefore they wouldn't be good legitimate models. So we have to worry a lot about acculturation because, humans tend to borrow ideas, and there's reasons why those ideas are transmitted and conserved, and therefore societies that are more acculturated may have picked up ideas and now they're transmitting them because they've become frequent and popular, and there's no reason to believe that would have happened in the past. We have to worry about stuff like levels of conflict. Some people have criticized some of the Aché studies. Why should you project Aché patterns into the past? Because the Aché were being invaded and attacked by modern European colonists, and that wasn't true, 20,000 years ago, and therefore the Aché have to be treated as a special case of what hunter-gatherers look like when they're running from invasion. And that's a really important and legitimate criticism. You can do the flip side and say that some of the current modern hunter-gatherer groups in the 20th century have been protected and isolated from warfare to the point where they don't have any threats of warfare, and that probably isn't representative of the human past either. So, what was going on 20,000 years ago is more like what I saw in the Hiwi in the 1980s, where when I would do focal man follows, so I'm studying hunting patterns, which has nothing to do with warfare, but my focal men, there were areas that they wouldn't go into to hunt, even though I knew there was a lot of game there. And when I started saying, asking them, why aren't we going out into this area? I know there's a lot of game there. They would say, because that's too close to the enemy village and we might end up getting shot and killed by an enemy raider. So warfare constrains human behavior, the threat of violence and so on, probably, in our ancestral past. And just looking at hunter-gatherer groups that are now being protected and have no warfare is probably also going to give you the wrong answer about some things. So we have to be really careful about, asking, are there current weird variables that wouldn't have applied in the past? And if so, maybe this group and their behavior is not going to be very representative of the past.
Mm-hmm. When you look across the different societies you've studied, do you find more differences or similarities? Because I ask you that question because people, when thinking about anthropological knowledge and what we know about other human societies and so on, there's always this question surrounding human nature, and if we have a shared human nature that plays a bigger role in our behavior than culture and cultural traits we acquire, or vice versa. I mean, do you think that's a too simplistic a question to ask, that it makes sense? Or
Yeah, well, it's a little bit more complicated because the variation is not just due to cultural differences. It can also be local adaptations to different ecological constraints. And
right.
I went into anthropology mainly because I had big questions in my mind about human universals. When I ran away from graduate school in molecular genetics and ran away down to the Amazon, what I wanted to do was live with a really remote tribe and see how similar they were to my American friends, and that would give me insights into what are, human universals, is what I thought. I'm very interested in human universals, and I think explaining them and where they came from and why they take the traits that they do is really important. But also, I would say I'm equally fascinated by variation. And most of anthropology, I would say, is actually more focused on variation. So, for example, Aché and Hiwi are both hunter-gatherers, and they both live in lowland South America, only a few thousand kilometers apart. The Hiwi use drugs every day of the year, pretty much, hallucinogenic drugs, and they dance almost every day of the year. They have tribal dances in the afternoon. The Aché don't do either one. They don't use any drugs, and they don't do any dancing. On the other hand, the Aché have super high divorce rates. The average post-menopausal woman that I interviewed had had 15 husbands in her lifetime, and Hiwi postmenopausal women have had one husband in a lifetime. So really high divorce in one place, almost no divorce at all in the other place. Aché share food communally, and Hiwi share it much more locally within their community. The Hiwi have quasi-arranged marriage, and Aché marriage partners totally choose themselves with no outside interference. Aché have a time allocation pattern where they do lots and lots of very strenuous labor, 8 hours a day on average, hunting and gathering. On the other hand, the Hiwi rest for 6 hours a day in their hammocks, just kind of chatting and joking and so on, and only hunt for a couple hours a day. The Aché have marked puberty ceremonies for both men and women, where they undergo very rigorous and public puberty rites, and the Hiwi don't have either one. So it's really easy, even with South American hunter-gatherers, to see tremendous variation. And every time we see that, it brings up a research question: why? Why is it the case that these guys have puberty ceremonies and these guys don't, or these people have really high divorce rates and these people have really low divorce rates? But on the other hand, where we started with this is human universals. Oh my gosh, yeah, there are definitely some things that we might, I don't know what other word to use other than human nature. Um, all what I learned that I was a really important lesson to me is that all humans everywhere on the planet care really deeply about family and friends. That's the center of their universe. That's what drives them. That's what they're motivated by. That's where they get all of their emotional, positive, uh, you know, reaction in life. And especially children. They love their children dearly. They'll sacrifice tremendously. Everywhere that I've been, that's true. Hiwi, Aché, South Africa, Mindanao in the Philippines, and so on and so on. So, and other human universe, people love to laugh and they love to sit around and joke and be happy together. People everywhere that I've been have what we might call communal feasting. All humans use extrasomatic forms of adornment, everything from piercings and tattooings to paintings and hairstyles and so on. So, yeah, there's a lot of universals. And some of them, are really ancient and probably come from our, mammalian ancestry and so on, like the fact that men are larger than women in every human society that we ever look at, and that sexual dimorphism and body size, it's a universal human trait, but it's deeper than humans. It, goes back to most mammals and so on. Um, in the hunter-gatherer studies where we have quantitative data, we always find that males travel more than females, on both on a daily basis and on a lifetime basis. So men tend to rove more than females do. Why are we built that way as a species? What's going on in the goals that males and females consider important, that males cover more distance? So yeah, there's some universals, and then there's all this variation that's fascinating.
Mhm. But do you think that variation you encounter between human societies, particularly these more traditional ones, would be explained mostly by differences in the ecological factors they are exposed to?
Uh, as opposed to cultural, is that what you're suggesting? I mean,
Yeah, I think I mean I didn't want to put things that way exactly because there are some aspects of culture that I would imagine also derive from those that same variation in ecology, let's say.
yeah, so I think the great challenge in human behavioral studies and evolutionary approaches, and the most exciting thing, but also the most complicated, complex, and confusing thing is that um, socially transmitted information, what we call culture and cultural variance, clearly can be shown to be the proximate causes of variation in some places for some patterns. But then also humans are a mammal, just like all other mammals. And the standard field of behavioral ecology, if you were studying behavior in other mammals, would tell you that when you see, essentially phenotypic plasticity, behavioral variation, it's often a local adaptation to differing ecological constraints. So, if I had my first knee-jerk reaction to something like divorce is that Well, we have other mammals that show a whole range of pair bond stability from high stability to low stability. And there's a lot of models about the kinds of ecological conditions that will favor pair bonding versus favor, mate desertion and serial mate seeking. And, so right off the bat, I would say I'm going to apply that. I'm going to suggest that the Aché live in a really different ecology that doesn't favor pair bond stability, and the Hiwi live in an ecology that favors pair bond stability, and the same thing would be true if we were looking at birds or whatever. But then on the other hand, I'm not so stupid as to realize that they have really strong cultural traditions and that they grow up with social norms where for the Aché, there's no stigma in getting divorced, and for the Hiwi, there's huge stigma. And where did those social norms come from, and why have they stabilized, and why do some norms spread? For example, monogamy in general has been spreading like wildfire for the last 700,000 years or so in human history. So, if we look at human societies 1,000 years ago, polygyny was all over the world, and it's becoming rarer and rarer in time. So, why are monogamous social norms spreading? And what are the factors that lead to that kind of spread? Gets us into issues about understanding cultural evolution and cultural transmission and so on. And I think this is the great challenge in anthropology and evolutionary human behavioral studies: is how can we integrate an adaptive kind of behavioral ecology perspective with a cultural transmission and cultural evolution perspective. And it's the reason why people like my colleague Rob Boyd came up with the term dual inheritance theory, because he realized that both ecology and culture are often involved in affecting behavioral outcomes, and it becomes really tricky to predict which one will be paramount.
Right. So let's now get into some more theoretical questions and specific aspects of human sociality you've done work on. So, what is foraging theory, and what aspects of human sociality is it applied to?
Yeah, so foraging theory in anthropology was actually borrowed straight from behavioral ecology and biology, but it turns out that foraging theory in biology is actually really, really similar to a lot of microeconomic theory, which was developed, a half century earlier. So people have repeatedly come up on this with this idea that living organisms might be motivated to maximize their individual gain rate from efforts. And economists basically assume in many human populations that people want to maximize profit, and therefore you can predict what they will do by asking, which of their economic alternatives would give them a bigger net gain. Biologists aren't happy just to say that living organisms want to maximize resource gain rates. They ask the question, why should organisms be designed that way? And the answer is pretty straightforward, that more resources can be turned into higher survivorship and higher fertility in virtually every life system that we look into. So it makes sense that natural selection would design organisms that should prioritize higher resource gain rates over lower gain rates when they're faced with alternatives. And that's what foraging theory is. It's basically a theory that says, let's look at alternative options. In the case of hunter-gatherers, we're looking at a whole suite of possible edible foods in the environment. So, for example, in the Paraguayan forest where the Aché live, there's about 400 species of edible vertebrates, and probably another 20 or 30 edible invertebrates, and another 50 or so species of edible fruits and plant products. And yet, when they move through the forest each day and you actually watch them hunt and gather, the vast majority of the economy comes from only about 20 of those resources. So, and we know they're encountering the other ones, and we know they're edible, and yet they're apparently just seeing them and then moving on to find something else. And foraging theory is a very formal mathematical set of equations that predicts which resources you would include when you encounter them in the environment. And It's based on maximizing your gain rate as, as a function of cost. So you not only do you have to focus on what food value you would get from a resource, but also how much would it cost you to acquire it. And that means how much time does it take to gather it and process it, or to hunt it, or to track it down after it's wounded, and so on and so on. And you put all of the potential gains into the numerator and all the costs into the denominator, and you essentially have a rate, a ratio, a rate of, gains of nutrients per unit time. And what foraging theory predicts is that you'll focus on the resources that increase your overall gain rate, and you'll ignore the ones that would decrease your gain rate. And this is how I actually started out in anthropology. The earliest part of my career was asking whether we could predict hunter-gatherer diets using optimal foraging theory. And a couple other people, maybe Bruce Winterhalter had done this up in Canada, and Eric Smith with the Inuit, and we were doing it with the Aché in South America, and there were people doing it in Australia. In a few years, we discovered that I would say foraging theory is moderately successful, meaning that in general, yes, it's the case that people pay attention to, what they can get from their labor input, and they care about getting resources that give high nutrient content with low time requirement, and they ignore, the other ones that would take them a long time and would give few nutrients. But then there's always some caveats which make things interesting. And what I got interested in, the caveat that was most interesting to me was macronutrients. So foraging theory basically is an economic optimization model that predicts that people will maximize caloric gain rate per unit time effort. And I got interested in the question, are calories really the best measure of nutrients? Because organisms really, what they want to maximize is fitness, not calories. And so is getting more calories going to increase your fitness? And we're talking about either improved survivorship or growth rates or fertility or whatever. Or could it be the case that some foods that have fewer calories but better macronutrient content, like higher in protein, might actually have more impact on your fertility? So I went off on a caveat for the last couple of years. I was working on foraging theory to see whether macronutrients matter. And I think the answer is that they obviously do in general in human societies. It's one reason why we pay so much more at the grocery store for protein lipid foods than we do for carbohydrate foods. The cheapest foods are, rice and cheap carbohydrates, and expensive foods per pound, let's say, are things like steak and whatever. So it's quite clear that the nutrients matter a little bit, but it's been kind of complicated to put that back into foraging theory and explain what's going on. And this actually leads into a lot of questions about the sexual division of labor. Why is it that men are hunting and women are gathering? Because they're getting really different macronutrient packages. Anyways.
Right. On the topic of food, why is food sharing so important in traditional societies?
Yeah, well, food sharing to me is exciting because humans do so much more of it than any other animal. There aren't really very many animals that do food sharing between unrelated adults in particular, and in humans it's really, really common. So what in the heck is going on? We're very focused on patterns that make humans look like they're very different from other species, and how did we get that way? The whole economic system in human societies is based on sharing and essentially kind of specialization and complementarity, where you get one thing and I get another thing, and then we share it so that we both have some of both when we come back. And, utility theory and economics could explain why you would do that when two different items have different utilities and you need some of both. But we also have a lot of food sharing is just designed to probably solve problems of variation. If you're going to live off of hunting, everybody knows, anybody's ever done any hunting, that most of the time you fail. You go out deer hunting all day and you come home empty-handed, you would starve to death and your family would starve to death if you didn't come up with a solution to that problem. And the solution in human societies to get around the variance issue, I see the same thing in my, sea nomad fisherman communities. You go out fishing all day and one guy with a net comes back with nothing and the other guy with the net comes back with 200 kilograms of fish. The obvious solution, which allows both of us to continue fishing, is to pool our stuff and kind of share it so that you know that on days when you strike out, you're still going to have something for your family to eat. And that actually allows humans to go into really high risky economic niches that other animals can't exploit. So we can take the risk. Hadza hunter-gatherers only usually get one game animal per month. You could never do that, in general as a mammal hunting if you didn't have other individuals who are going to bring food in for you on the days when you get nothing. So the whole human kind of economic niche, and then we've got another issue that I haven't talked about yet. The socioeconomic niche of humans is one that people like me call cooperative breeding. It's a term borrowed out of biology, which is that we know that breeding pairs essentially cannot raise offspring on their own. When we look at the economics of it in hunter-gatherer societies, it would be impossible. And the only way that it's working is they have what biologists would call helpers at the nest that are assisting by bringing in extra resources during the phases of your long lifespan when you actually have more juvenile mouths to feed than you could possibly feed. You've got helpers at the nest who are helping you do that. And so sharing drives cooperative breeding in humans, and we become a really interesting and weird species. There's only a few cooperative breeding mammals. A lot of birds are cooperative breeders. All the social insects are cooperative breeders, and those kinds of species show a lot of really interesting different traits than you find in general.
Mm-hmm. So, in the context of evolutionary anthropology, where would you place something like life history theory? I mean, what aspects of human behavior and human sociality can we get a better grasp of by applying this theory?
Yeah, so this one is a little complicated. I'm going to try to kind of stick to some notes on this. Life history theory, I think, is at the very core of all of life, understanding life in general, breaking life down to the realization that what life is all about is complex chemical compounds that we call life forms that through the process of natural selection have been designed to harvest energy and turn it into replicates. And in order to do that, you got to have basically a program, and that programs that optimize the harvest and use of energy in order to maximize net lifetime output are the ones that have become common over time on the planet. So life history theory really gives the big overall picture of organisms' possible lifestyle. It looks at the timing of events in the life course, especially mortality and fertility schedules, but also investment schedules, the ontogeny of energy development over the lifespan in different life stages and different strategies, such that you ultimately maximize net lifetime output. And I like to think of this, so in some ways, life history theory is actually easier to imagine as an economic theory rather than biological one. If we imagine that life forms, that we're all endowed by our parents with a little factory, which is our body, and that little factory is what we would call our starting capital, and then you got to figure out how to make the most income off that little factory in its expected lifetime. So we're going to try to maximize the net lifetime output from our little factory, given the starting capital. And that means you got to think about all kinds of investments, and there's lots of trade-offs. So maybe it would be good to invest in making your factory bigger. Let's grow it. Let's have some growth. because once the factory's bigger, then the yearly output or the daily output could be a lot higher. But is it worth investing in growth? Depends on how long the factory's going to last. If it's going to be destroyed by an accident tomorrow, then you shouldn't waste energy in making it bigger. You should just go ahead and, profit maximize right now. But if you know the factory is going to last for another 50 years, it's probably worth investing for the next few years in making it bigger, because then you can reap the benefits through the whole rest of the lifespan and having a bigger factory. And the same, so that's talking about growth patterns, and the same thing is true for things like learning and development. When should your legs get longer? When should your ears get bigger? Whatever, all depends on when you can use it and how long you can use it for, and are the payoffs over the long run going to be worth it? Which means that, life histories are the timing of mortality and fertility schedules and all the investment patterns in development. Life histories evolve to be optimal depending on constraints that you can't do anything about. So the single biggest constraint in the universe is how quickly are you going to be destroyed? Death, unavoidable causes of death, what life history theorists call extrinsic mortality. Nothing you could do would change it. If you're going to be killed by predators or killed by accident or whatever, then you should speed everything up. You should only grow a little bit. You should immediately start reproducing as soon as possible. And you have organisms that have really fast life histories where they're usually small, they don't grow very much, they start reproducing at young ages, and they also don't invest very much in somatic repair and somatic maintenance, so they start aging very quickly and senesce and die sometimes, after only a couple of years. On the other hand, if you don't have high extrinsic mortality, you can afford to invest in things like learning and cognition and brain size and body size and in somatic maintenance. So high oxidative repair, antioxidant DNA repair mechanisms, so on, which means that aging is postponed, and then you have an even longer lifespan. So all of these things end up creating a life history for different organisms, and that life history is the biggest single constraint that determines everything else about what the organism can and should do during its life cycle.
So just to talk about a particular example, what is the relationship between life history and parental investment?
So, parental investment, there's actually two angles to that. One is what kinds of parental investment at what points in time in the offspring would be beneficial to the life history of the offspring, and then there's another one, which is what parental investment should be favored by the adult who's looking to either use energy in parental investment or to use that energy perhaps to produce more offspring, or to invest a little bit in its own body so that it has a longer lifespan and so on. So parental investment decisions are critical central components to life history theory.
Right. So, what do you think is the best approach to understand the evolution of human cooperation? Because, for example, from an evolutionary perspective, we have mechanisms like kin selection slash inclusive fitness theory. Then there are people that also propose cultural group selection mechanisms. What do you think about it?
Yeah, what I think we've learned in my career, so I started out when I was really young, I did optimal foraging theory, and then the next thing I jumped into while I was still in graduate school was looking at food sharing in humans, because it was so striking and notable that it's so different from other primates and other mammals. And the challenge was, food sharing to the individual donor who's going to give away food is potentially really costly. So we have to identify what could be the benefit that would make it worth it. And at that time, the theory in biology was really focused on two things. That one, you would be willing to share if you get inclusive fitness benefits, if the resources are being used by individuals who are likely to carry your same altruistic sharing genes, then those genes would multiply over time. So everybody understood that kin selection could drive food sharing, and in fact, that's why Bill Hamilton started out looking at social insects, and he was fascinated by bees sacrificing to provision the hive, and it turned out that the reason was because those worker bees are highly related to the queen and all of her offspring and all of their siblings and so on. The other thing that we were focused on, so, I was doing this work in the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, starting to collect data. Bob Trivers had really pointed out to everybody that we could get something called reciprocal altruism, where you give up resources as long as you have a high statistical probability of getting back resources that are worth more to you at the time you get them back than what you gave up at the time that you gave it up. And economists very quickly jumped on that and showed that as long as you have some kind of diminishing gains curve of utility or fitness as a function of amount, so that the more and more you have of something, the less an extra increment is to you, it's really easy to go ahead and give up a little bit. If we think about food, if you already have 10,000 calories, which is more than you and your family can eat, giving up the next 1,000 calories is really cheap to you in terms of what it costs you in fitness, because you weren't going to be able to eat it anyways, and if you did, it wasn't going to have very much impact on your health. You're already well fed. So go ahead and give up the extra 1,000 calories if you can get it back tomorrow when you have nothing, because when you have nothing, 1,000 calories has a huge positive effect on your health and survivorship and so on. So the idea that you give up stuff that's not worth very much and later on you get back stuff that's worth a lot more to you, as long as you have some kind of statistical guarantee that you're going to get back. And that was the kicker. And the reason why reciprocal altruism is actually pretty rare in nature is that it's really hard to have a good guarantee that you're going to get something back from individuals. In game theory, they call this defection. So it's really likely that you give up resources and then the recipient defects on you and doesn't give you anything back. And so we have to have all kinds of magical mechanisms that will statistically guarantee reciprocity will take place. And I think what we've learned in the last 40 years is that human cooperation is actually way more complicated than the simple version that I just gave that we thought back in the 70s, that it's either all kin selection or it's all reciprocal altruism. Now it's looking like an awful lot of it is some type of reciprocity, but the magical mechanisms that guarantee statistically that you will get return back are the things that humans have invented with cultural institutions, and with the fact that we have language, for example, is really critical. One reason why organisms other than humans probably don't engage so much in reciprocal altruism is that humans, because of our language, have what we would call reputation. So if you're living in the neighboring village and you have defected on somebody, and then you come over and you try to con me into reciprocity, I already know that you're a defector. I know that you have a long history of defection because my friends who live in the neighboring village have told me, oh, this guy's a real schmuck and he's not going to pay back. So the fact that we have language allows us to keep track of defection much more efficiently than other animals can. And it means that humans have reputation, and that the only way you're going to find anybody who's willing to get into a reciprocal arrangement with you is if you have a good reputation based on your past behavior. But that's part of what guarantees statistically that, reciprocal altruism will pay off. So humans, it's turning out there's all kinds of social norms and reputation and other fun, what I call little magical mechanisms that stabilize reciprocity so that it works way, way better in our species, apparently, than other species. And this is part of, again, what makes us really special, is that we're way more cooperative than other mammals.
Mm-hmm. So, talking about another aspect of sociality, do human societies also have fission-fusion phenomena like we find in other great apes like chimpanzees, for example?
Yeah, I would say that, but what's interesting about humans is that our fission fusion happens at lots of different time scales.
Hmm.
So great apes, like chimpanzees, have a daily fission fusion. They separate and they come together. Um, Human hunter-gatherer bands do that. Everybody gets up in the morning and everybody goes off in a different direction. The women go off collecting plants, the men go off hunting. We all come back together at the end of the day in order to share. So once again, sharing is really critical. That's what brings everybody back to a common camp at the end of the day. Um, but humans also, and because of that, we can get some complementarity where you can focus on getting fruit and I can focus on getting honey, and then we trade resources and share them with each other when we come back. But hunter-gatherer societies have fission fusion at lots of time scales. They might separate during the day and come together at night. They might also separate for a couple of weeks and then come back together later on at a place where they know there's a good food supply. They might separate for a whole season, like in the case of the Hiwi, they all dispersed in the dry season and then conglomerated back together in a large camp in the wet season. And then you even get multi-year things where people go off in their own direction for 2 or 3 years, and then when conditions are right, they all come together in a gigantic group for a communal caribou hunt or something like that. So we've got fission fusion going on in human societies at lots of different time scales, which is really fun and makes things, once again, even more complicated. Also, our fission fusion system, uh, the kind of residential group level fusions, allows humans to kind of conveniently solve problems of mate searching and inbreeding. So most hunter-gatherer bands spend periods of time fairly isolated away from other bands. And young adults who are looking for mates get a little bit anxious, but they know that all I got to do is wait a few more weeks until the palm fruits are in season, and then I know all the bands are going to come together in a palm grove, and then I can look for a girlfriend or a boyfriend or whatever. So we use our fission fusion to solve economic stuff, but also to solve mate searching problems as well.
Mhm. And what is co-residence and how does it work in human societies?
Yeah, so co-residence, I most of anthropology calls these resonance patterns, but I kind of grabbed the term co-residence because I think it's important to be focusing on the fact that we've got multiple individuals who are co-residing in a single camp. And so what's interesting, mammals in general and social mammals that live in like troops and groups and so on, usually one of the two sexes will disperse at early adulthood. So you either have male philopatric, well, most mammals are female philopatric. So all the females who are born into a natal group stay there. And at adolescence, all the males migrate out and go to other groups looking for mating possibilities.
Mhm.
Some species like chimpanzees, you have the reverse. You have males who stay at home in their natal group and females disperse at adolescence. Humans are really interesting in that we must have evolved our system probably, I'm going to guess, from a male philopatric ape species because most of the other apes tend to be male philopatric. Um, but at some point in time, we've gotten into a situation where humans do things really differently. So it is true if we look at anthropological societies that patrilocal and matrilocal are very common terms, meaning that when the new couple gets married, they either live with the husband's kin, that would be patrilocal, or with the wife's kin would be matrilocal. But humans are really interesting and again kind of weird in that bilocal patterns are extremely common, which means that their human couples tend to be opportunistic. In other words, they look at their situation and they look at their kin opportunities and they say, where would be best for us to go? Should we go live with your parents or should we go live with my parents? Or and in many cases, it's also, should we go live with your brothers and sisters or should we go live with my brothers and sisters or a particular sibling? Should we go live with my sister because her husband happens to be a really great hunter and we know we're going to get lots of meat if we live with her? Or should we go live with your brother because he's really widely known as being a fierce warrior and he'll protect the camp and we won't have to worry about raids and so on. So humans have become very opportunistic in their co-residence patterns. And the only reason we're able to do this ultimately is that, bizarrely enough, gets tied back into things having to do with our breeding pattern. That at some point in time, when humans became pair bonded, and when you also get paternal investment, what ends up happening is that if you're little offspring and your parents are pair bonded and you have a long juvenile period, you get to know all your brothers and sisters because brothers and sisters don't disperse immediately a year or two. They stay home for 15 years. And so all the brothers and sisters know each other really well. They know that they're full siblings and they recognize mom and dad as mom and dad. You don't have to do DNA testing to know that the guy who sleeps with your mom every night for 15 years and brings home all the food is probably your dad. And so they recognize pair bonding and they also recognize paternal investment. And the reason paternal investment is really critical and the fact that you recognize that it's going on is that when your sister at adolescence migrates into a new group, and you don't see her again for a while, and then you encounter that group, you immediately see that she's hanging out with a guy, and because of your experience, you know that guy must be her pair bonded partner. You also know that that guy is investing heavily in your sister's offspring because paternal investment is common, and therefore this other strange guy that you've never seen before is both taking care of your sister and raising kids who share a fourth of your genes. So instead of that man being your enemy on sight, who you would kill, which is what chimpanzees do, foreign males in other communities are enemies on sight to be killed, the guy that you're seeing in the next group over, you recognize is pair bonded to your sister and is investing in her offspring, which share a fourth of your genes, so he's your ally instead of your enemy. And the fact that neighboring groups of males can recognize each other as allies rather than enemies allows visiting. And it also allows moving back and forth between communities. So I don't have to stay in this community. I can go ahead and go live with my sister in her community for a while because I know that her husband's going to be a good guy to me because we have common interest in, he knows that his offspring are related to me by 1/4 and so on and so on. Anyway, so humans, because of pair bonding and because of paternal investment, form alliances and friendships with neighboring groups rather than killing them on sight. That allows intercommunal transfer, visiting, and so on and so on. And all of a sudden you get a completely different social system with a huge expanded social network of individuals that you can interact with. And once again, I want to emphasize that this is unique. There is no other species, we've got about 5 million eukaryotic species on planet Earth right now. None of the other species known on planet Earth recognize affines and preferentially treat them well. So in-laws, ironically enough, in-laws are really important and unique to human social organization.
That's very interesting. I would like to ask you now about marriage. Is it really a human universal? Because I think that it was 2 years ago I got into some of that anthropological literature and it seemed it was in fact a human universal. And what kind of impact does it have on how societies get structured?
Yeah, so once again, it looks like what I would call marriage is probably recognized pair bonds and co-residence between males and females over long periods of time. That arrangement appears to be universal as far as I can tell in humans. There are a few societies where males and females don't really co-reside all that well, but they do form bonds, and daddy comes home at frequent intervals and invests in offspring and so on. So I'm going to say, yeah, that it looks to me like marriage is pretty much a human universal. And it's really, really important for, the reasons that I just mentioned. But one of the things that I think is really fascinating about human mating, I recently had a little bit of an exchange with David Buss over this because he's published a lot of stuff about human mating and made some statements about that there's, we know lots and lots about universal things of human mating, and a lot of the data he was citing was from Western weird societies again, is that actually there's a lot of things about our own society that really mislead us. And so we need to look at ancestral societies to ask what has the human mating pattern been. And one of the things I find most unique and fascinating and interesting is that other people stick their nose into your mate choice at an incredibly high degree in humans. So we've got, the extreme version would be arranged marriage, and arranged marriage of infants or even, pre-birth in places like Australian Aborigines where they have betrothals to girls who haven't even been born yet and so on. But the point is that even in the less extreme cases, having particularly close kin get involved in your mate choice decisions is something that I think is, again, a pretty unique human issue and is really important in understanding human sociality. And the reason why close kin feel justified and they're invested in your mate choice is because we're cooperative breeders. So if your aunts and uncles and your cousins and your grandparents and your parents are all going to help you to raise your offspring, then they basically have a say in who you're going to make the offspring with. So you don't get to choose your own spouse because they want you to choose a spouse that comes from a family that has resources or a good reputation for being cooperative or whatever, whatever. So that, human mating is really, mate choice is not really totally about individual choice. In a lot of ways, it's about families choosing allied families as part of their strategy for dual investment. That the other family is going to be investing in, joint shared genetic outcomes, and we're going to be investing kind of like business partners. And when you do look at it that way, everybody who has a stake in the matter, who's got some genes at stake and is planning on putting up some resources, feels like they're justified to get involved in the decision. So human marriage is in a lot of ways really different in some ways than other animals in that we don't see nearly as much individual choice and a lot more pressure by other individuals.
Mm-hmm. So I've already talked several times on the show about cumulative culture and how it seems, or as far as we know, we humans are the only species on the planet who has it. Other species have culture, but not really cumulative culture. But there's one aspect that I haven't asked anybody about yet. That is, what are interband interactions and how do they contribute to cumulative culture?
Yeah, so a minute ago when we were comparing chimps and humans, I mentioned that chimpanzee females disperse at adolescence, males stay home. As a result, there's no recognition of pair bonding, there's no recognition of paternal investment. So neighboring communities have males who are enemies, and they pretty much kill each other on sight when they have an opportunity. No peaceful interactions. Because humans, on the other hand, recognize, their siblings' spouses or their children's spouses that might be in different communities, they're free to move back and forth. And as a result, you get much higher levels of what we would call, interband interaction rates. And we got interested in this about 10 years ago and started measuring the interband interaction probabilities between different individuals. I teamed up with Brian Wood, and he had been a student of mine earlier. He collected data in the Hadza, I collected data in the Aché. We were able to calculate the number of lifetime interactants that are expected by adult Hadza and Aché and compare that to chimpanzees. And there's like about an order of magnitude, slightly more than an order of magnitude difference which means humans basically have a social network of intimate interactants that's 10 or 15 times higher than chimpanzees. And the reason why that, there's a lot of, interesting things about that, but one implication is that that means way more people that you could possibly be exposed to learn something through social learning. So we all know that great innovations are rare. People don't come up with amazing innovations very often. And your likelihood of being exposed to a new innovation that's useful is a direct function of how many other individuals you get to observe at close range and close interaction. And it looks like humans, are seeing 15 times as many other adult models that they could learn from than chimps are. And that allows us to pick up really rare, novel, but advantageous cultural traits, which can be learned through social learning and then transmitted to lots and lots of other people because of this huge social network. And once those traits, one problem with innovations is that if innovations are limited to a small group, then random chance and accidents mean they can be extinguished really easily. If there's only 3 people who know how to make an arrow and they all die in an accident or something happens, then making arrows becomes a lost thing. But if 10,000 people know how to make an arrow, and if you're going to be exposed to 10,000 more people in your lifetime, you might find one guy who's figured out a clever way to put feathers on the arrow. And so humans, because of this huge network of interactants that's, like I said, more than an order of magnitude bigger than chimps, are exposed to great ideas, build on them, and they don't lose those ideas through random chance. And I think this is probably one of the big reasons why humans achieve cumulative culture. We know that lots of smart animals can learn through social learning, and they have rudimentary culture. Chimps certainly do that, but they just don't seem to be building on innovations generation after generation. And ultimately, it's cumulative culture in combination with cooperation that we've already talked about. If you add together cumulative culture and cooperation, that's where you get the spectacular difference between Homo sapiens and any other species. So the reason we can send a man to the moon is not necessarily because we have the biggest brains, but because we've achieved cumulative culture, and the technology to do that, was developed over tens of thousands of years, and also hundreds of thousands of individuals cooperating together to ultimately build that technology. So, I often laugh that I hear the physicists and whatever exploring, saying we're looking for intelligent life in the universe. And I gave a talk a couple of times at one of these groups, and I said, we're not looking for intelligent life in the universe. We're looking for cooperative life forms that have cumulative culture. And that's enough to be able to put you on the moon.
Right. So is it right to say that hunter-gatherer societies are more economically equal than agricultural and industrialized societies?
I think so, because we can tool up and measure this objectively. We measure this using the Gini coefficient a lot of times, and if you do a Gini coefficient on either income or accumulated wealth, what we would call net worth, those measurements show that hunter-gatherer societies are more equal than other societies. It's really hard to accumulate wealth in hunter-gatherer societies. That transfers, because of sharing of resources and so on, transfers are really high. People who have bad luck and problems and so on are subsidized by others, and that tends to level out wealth differentials. And everybody is reliant on that social system or they wouldn't survive. So you can't become stingy and hoarding and so on, because you would end up paying the price eventually when if you have an accident or a problem, then all of a sudden you'd be dead if nobody else wants to help you. So there's no choice but to be, fairly generous and concerned about the welfare of others so that they will help you as well. And that tends to level off, income disparities. And then accumulative wealth is really just not possible in hunter-gatherer societies. That being said, though, I mean, this is what's fun about, ecology and kind of behavioral ecology and so on, is that there are ecologies that allow for more accumulation and greater differential. And those are places where resources are highly concentrated in predictable and defensible places. So this allows for the emergence of what I would call capitalism. And where we tend to see that a lot is in coastal environments, both marine coastal and riverine coastal and whatever, really high concentrations of resources that can be defended. So if we think about Northwest Coast Indians in North America, salmon runs where 5 billion calories worth of salmon are going to go through a little tiny narrow gorge. And if your clan can control that, they can allow other clans access only if those clans pay deference to them. And you start getting the emergence of what I would call, capitalist societies where some individuals control the means of production and other individuals have to work for them and give them part of the production as the cost of getting access. So there are conditions where we can see, emerging wealth differentials even in hunter-gatherer societies. But in, the conditions over world history have favored more and more situations where few individuals can highly control the means of production, and that means that they can become enormously wealthy, and other individuals basically have to work for them and give part of the productivity as the cost of having access to those places.
So, just one last topic before we go. And because today we talked about some isolated tribes, I know that you're also interested in protecting those tribes and how we can do it. So, why is it important, apart, of course, from some moral questions surrounding protecting other human beings and so on? Why is it important to protect these societies, and what would we lose if we didn't do it?
So I'm actually going to answer that. The reason to protect them is, in fact, the moral imperative that, we're talking about human beings. These are people who, as all humans, should have rights to life and freedom and happiness and so on. And there's a long world history of groups conquering and exterminating and expropriating and exploiting other groups. And, it's just not fair by our terms of, basic human equal rights and morality and so on. And I think that's the strongest justification for protecting isolated tribes. I'm not going to make the argument that they should be protected because we would lose cultural diversity. A lot of people might want to say that. I personally am of the view that human cultural diversity is in transition all the time, and that we're just simply destined, because the same traits that make our species successful, which is cultural learning and cultural borrowing, inevitably will lead to cultural extinction. So, for example, the ancient and traditional languages around the world are all going to be lost. That's sad because we're going to lose linguistic diversity, and it might be nice to keep a record of that and so on. But on the other hand, those tribes that are giving up their language in order to speak dominant languages that gives them access to tremendous social and economic opportunities, I'm not going to mourn that loss. They're humans. They deserve the right to be able to effectively communicate with others and get the benefits. And the cost of that is going to be that, yes, they are going to lose their language. So I've had discussions with Aché tribal members about the things that they're losing, and they're losing this and that, and they don't do traditional hairstyles the way they used to, and they don't do body tattooing the way they used to, and lip piercing and so on. And I'm like, it was great when you did it, and it's your tradition, and you shouldn't be ashamed. You should be proud of it and everything. But ultimately, it's not surprising that your children want to wear Western clothing and, look like average Paraguayans on the street, because there are huge social and economic benefits to that, and I'm not I don't live the way my great grandparents did either, and I don't want to force on the Aché the idea that they should have to, maintain all the traditions of their great grandparents. So I don't think to me, the argument is those tribes should be protected because they deserve to be protected, not necessarily that, we need to keep some kind of human cultural zoo where all cultures are kept in secret cages so that we can all observe them later on and admire it and say, oh, look how cute the way they used to wear their hair back in the olden days or whatever.
Right. But I mean, is there something, some knowledge coming from anthropology that we can apply to help protecting these tribes?
Well, this gets into the other issue, which I think is a really important issue, and it's been the most painful, probably experience in my career because I've gotten horrendously vitriolic attacks against my personal human character, which is debates about how to best protect isolated people. And I'm going to probably start by saying that most of the people who are the nastiest in their critiques of me have never spent a day in their life with isolated people, and I've spent 45 years living in close, intimate proximity in their houses with them and their families, some of my best friends, people that I would call family members. So my viewpoint on how to best protect isolated tribes comes from asking what would I want for myself and my family if I were in their situation? How would I want, this to, and my perspective, and I wrote an essay in Science on this, which was lauded by a lot of very experienced field anthropologists who wrote me secret messages saying, wow, that was exactly right on. And it was absolutely hated by a lot of indigenous rights organizations who have really gone after me in the internet and called me in unimaginable names of. Anyways, is that I think there's two reasons why planned and well executed contacts with uncontacted tribes is by far the best solution for them. The first reason is that my experience in 45 years is that whenever people and places claim they're protecting isolated tribes, it always turns out that they're doing a lousy job of protecting. So I'll go after the Brazilian government as my example. They claim to be protecting a bunch of isolated tribes, and every one of those tribes I know are being secretly invaded by loggers, miners, drug smugglers, hunters, and so on and so on. And the Brazilian government either doesn't have the resources or more likely is not willing to spend the resources that would be required for true protection. And so, in fact, by isolating those tribes but not fully protecting them, we make them even worse victims, which is they're getting victimized. Miners, gold miners are coming in and killing them, and then we're not hearing about it because we don't have any interaction with those tribes. There's nobody going in and talking to them every day where they can report and say, oh my God, yesterday we were upriver hunting and these guys came in and they slaughtered 3 of us. If you're not communicating on a daily basis, you are not protecting a tribe. That's what I've learned on planet Earth. It would take thousands and thousands of guards to surround the territory of one of these isolated tribes and effectively keep out the bad guys. And if that's not happening, then the only way to protect them is to be talking to them every day so they can report violations and we can then take action. So from a purely pragmatic point of view, I came to the conclusion in my work with remote, isolated, and uncontacted tribes in Peru and the border with Brazil in Manu Park that the safest thing is to have a peaceful, controlled contact with those tribes with daily or frequent communication and interaction so that they can report violations and we can do something to try to protect their territories. So that was my first argument, and it was very unpopular by some groups, as I mentioned, that the best thing to do with so-called uncontacted groups is actually contact them for their own protection. The second argument I make, which I don't think some of my critics even understand at all, because a lot of these, so-called human rights groups and so on don't really have any training in anthropology, is I think they fail to understand our species, that humans are a highly social species, and that, remember we were talking a few minutes ago about intergroup interaction?
Mhm.
Our species thrives off intergroup interaction. We borrow cultural traits, we borrow technology, we borrow ideas, tools, and so on and so on. We're a highly social species. We have probably been for hundreds of thousands of years. We depend on intergroup interaction. And I think that enforced isolation, which is really what some groups are advocating, is inhuman. It's inhumane, and it's not what those people want. And this gets me back to, I don't want to get too high and mighty about this, but I spent 45 years doing field work. I speak 11 languages. I have interviewed newly contacted natives within minutes or hours or days of their first contact and asked them questions about the pros and cons of, do you wish you were still back there when you guys were living in the forest? Did you want to meet outsiders and blah, blah, blah? And the answer, I think, is predictable given human sociality, which is that the tribes are staying isolated because they're scared to death that they're going to be massacred or enslaved or exploited. And that's usually based on some history. However, if we could guarantee them that they won't be massacred and enslaved and exploited, they would all choose to walk out of the forest tomorrow and make direct contact and interaction with other humans, because that's what humans are all about. Nobody wants, we impose isolation as punishments. We do this in prisons, and we used to put prisoners on islands and stuff. Social isolation is a punishment to humans. It's not something anybody chooses voluntarily, except in the case where you're scared to death that your neighbors are going to kill you. And these groups, a lot of them are mistakenly believing that, if outsiders contacted them, they would all be massacred tomorrow. And if we can guarantee that's not going to happen, they would all want contact right now, today, and they're going to reap all kinds of benefits. And we talked about this earlier in your program. There are pluses and minuses, but medical treatment and being able to get access to technology that makes their lives easier, meeting their nutritional needs, and so on and so on. There are huge benefits for them to have interaction with the outside world. And once again, we'll be able to more effectively protect and help them if we do that. So my take on this question is not so much as an anthropologist as it's a human being. I've lived with these people. I know them. I care about them. And I say, what would I want for my own family? And I wouldn't want my own family to be surrounded in a, indigenous reserve and protected and isolated for 200 years by the Brazilian government. And I don't think that's what any of these tribes people wants.
Mm-hmm. Very well. Okay, so just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet? And by the way, and since I think that's a very important subject, the issue of protecting isolated tribes, are there any organizations out there who work under those principles you just told us about and that have anthropological training or not?
Well, I wouldn't say they have no anthropological training. I would just say that a lot of the most vociferous critics of the view that I just put forward are people who basically haven't spent a day in their life living with indigenous tribes. They run organizations that I admire that defend human rights and indigenous rights and so on, but they're really insistent that they think they know everything, that they're right and I'm wrong, and that I don't know what I'm talking about and they do. And, I would just ask them to realize that I spent my whole life with these people, and I think I have more insight into what's best for them and what they want. And full isolated protection, it might look cute. It might allow us to go in and take nice pictures for National Geographic of people wearing adornments and feathers and so on because they're so isolated. But that's not, what you would want for your children. If it was your children out there, you want them to have the opportunities and the advantages that you get from interacting with the world at large. There's a reason why we're expanding into a global community. There's lots of advantages to having interaction in a global community. So you asked about where people can look at my work. So my scientific and academic research have about maybe 185 published papers in peer-reviewed journals. All that stuff, the best way to find it, of course, is on Google Scholar. I don't know if you've told your listeners about Google Scholar, but Google Scholar has a subsection called profiles. You can go, if you Google the word Google Scholar, it will come up, and if you put in profiles, you can then type in the name of somebody like me, and very quickly get a complete list of every single thing I've ever published in my life, and a lot of stuff that you get free copies, PDF files of the stuff, so you can actually read it. And you can also, of course, interesting, you can look at the citation count. So you can see which kinds of research have had a lot of impact on the scientific communities, highly cited, and which ones were lesser importance. This stuff that we've been talking at the very end of your interview about my positions on human rights and so on, I don't publish all that much on this. I did one invited essay for Science magazine because they specifically invited me to write about it, and they knew that I had personal experience and insights. I've been invited repeatedly over and over again to debate the issue, and I generally avoid the debates because they're nasty and ugly, and people call me ugly names. I don't need that in my life. I visit these isolated communities several times a year, and they're my life, and I don't really care about a debate in Europe over what to do with these tribes. I'd rather go visit the tribes with my free time. So I don't really have good leads on that, other than, like I said, the essay that we wrote in Science about 5 years ago. And that essay also shows up on Google Scholar, by the way.
Very well. Okay, so Dr. Hill, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
Thanks, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the channel. It's thanks to people like you that it keeps running, so I will leave links in the description box for PayPal and Patreon. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Pereira, Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimir, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enrique Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columba, Jorge Pinha, Phil Cavana, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslem Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Kian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Nirban Balachandran, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, and Sergio Quadriano. Thank you for all.